mean, you can imagine someone playing a bugle at night and blowing whistles like policemen, and it was really horrible.
We had about 200, 150 or more Americans, and when it was all over, there was only 12 of us left.
Had his face blown, and I still have the little note that he wrote me, "Will I live?"
It's not just that the weather was cold, it was that we didn't have any shelter.
Really in shock, and some of them were actually crying.
When the plane crashed, I was standing right back here. When it hit, I hit the floor.
One fellow, before he got on my airplane, just peeled off his toes and flipped them away like he was throwing rotten apples out of a barrel.
Voices from Korea are memories of a half-century ago, when the United States had barely recovered from World War II. Once again, America was called to battle, attempting this time to halt the advance of communism. These voices describe war as a combination of teamwork, dedication, challenge, bravery, hardship, and death. Throughout the conflict, elements we now call air mobility, airlift, aeromedical evacuation, and aerial refueling were used in combat. Voices from Korea shares the stories of these accomplishments through memories of those who were there. The war has been called Truman's War because it was Truman who said, "We've got to stop the sons of bitches no matter what, and that's all there is to it." The Korean War was also known as a police action, an undeclared war, to be fought under the United Nations flag. For many, it was the forgotten war, but the Korean conflict helped shape the American landscape for the next half-century. In August of 1945, Korea was divided into two countries. The Soviets helped establish a Stalinist-style dictatorship in Pyongyang, North Korea, under the leadership of Kim Il-sung. Meanwhile, America attempted, with only partial success, to establish a democracy under Syngman Rhee in South Korea. Under the cover of darkness, at 3:30 Sunday morning, June 25, 1950, the Korean War began when 250,000 North Korean troops launched a massive invasion, storming across the 38th parallel in a World War II-style blitzkrieg. On June 27th, North Korean aircraft attacked Seoul, and General Douglas MacArthur directed 150 tons of ammunition to be airlifted from Japan to Korea. 3 days later, on June 30th, President Truman ordered ground forces into South Korea and authorized the Air Force to bomb North Korea. The next day, the first U.S. infantry unit arrived in Korea. To regain lost territory, MacArthur launched a risky but technically brilliant assault at the port of Incheon, near Seoul, on September 15th. This was followed by the 8th Army's breakout from the Pusan perimeter, the liberation of Seoul, and a continued drive northward. MacArthur predicted an end to enemy resistance by Thanksgiving and withdrawal of the U.S. 8th Army to Japan by Christmas. This was not to be. In the quest for that home-by-Christmas promise, U.S. troops were sent north of the 38th parallel toward the Chinese border, despite warnings from China that they would come to the aid of North Korea. General MacArthur allowed his forces to be stretched too thin and to be separated by a mountain range running down the spine of Korea. It was a recipe for disaster. It was called Chosin.
As far as the Chosin Reservoir goes, it was a lesson learned that you can spread your troops too thin to accomplish a mission. And we had done that, spread too thin. But we did get out.
Actually, I didn't know there was a Chinaman in Korea. To the best of my knowledge, we were told that our company commander had volunteered us to go to Coterie and help break up some roadblocks between Coterie and Hagaroo. And I don't think we, not a man in the outfit other than maybe the officers, knew that we were going to engage the Chinese in battle. And it was a big shock.
We had a new problem. We kept running into Chinese who would try to cut us off. But the newspapers and news kept saying the communist Chinese forces weren't there. But we kept fighting them all the way up through the mountains till they gave us a 2-day march, non-stop. And it had been 100 degrees plus in South Korea in September. Now we were hitting way below zero. And they marked the day it hit 25 below and we were out on patrol. And then it got really cold and we didn't touch metal, you froze to it. But we had to fight in those conditions. And we didn't even know where the chosen reservoir was till we went up the right side of it. And they told us, just dig in for the night. We move out to the Yalu River in the morning, get to the river and we'll end this war. You can go home. It didn't happen that way.
They really like to fight at night. But we fought them all day on the 29th of November. And later on in the evening, of course, we had never encountered anything like this before. And they played taps on their bugles. They blew whistles. It was certainly something that I didn't expect.
They had some guy over there on the loudspeakers chatting to Chinese, and they would blow taps about every 15 or 20 minutes all during the night, and they continued to do that, and they told us if we did not surrender in the next 5 minutes that they would kill us to the last man with our own mortars, which had been captured from. And so we got together and went across the river, and 2 days later, on the second day of December, I showed up at Coterie at the Marine aid station there, and they just left us out, put us on a stretcher and left us out there in the snow. And
our 2 battalions, what was left of them, started fighting their way down the road. If we could make it 11 miles, we'd get to the Marine perimeter at Hagaruri. But we ran out of everything halfway there. There was nobody left to drive the trucks. Half the vehicles wouldn't run. Most were out of ammunition. The last ridge we took, the walking wounded took it. They divided their ammo and had 3 rounds apiece. They fixed bayonets and took that ridge from the Chinese. But since we're all out of ammo, it wasn't long until we were overrun by the Chinese.
We fought our way all day and only made about 6 miles. And in the evening of the 29th, we encountered heavy Chinese forces. And my company, B Company of the 31st Infantry, was almost annihilated overnight. And of course the Chinese took several prisoners, and I was one of the fortunate ones. I had been wounded earlier in the evening. We fought our way out and back to the Marine compound in Coterie.
we were ambushed by 2 regiments of Chinese, and we were 1 infantry company, and we ran down to the riverbed, which was the Chongjing River, feeds the Chosin Reservoir, and we fought there all night, and I was wounded 5 times during the night.
When the enemy got to our truck, they found no fuel in the tank, so it was too shot up. So they started, 1 man climbed up on the side for a better aim and started shooting in the truck. 1 shot from the tailgate, and 1 walked around the truck executing the men under the truck. And all I could think of is, I got to fight with these men. They're so brave, and nobody's going to be alive to tell anybody how brave they were. They just looked at their executioner and took their shot. When the rifle barrel moved to me, I said, Jesus, here I come. The muzzle blast knocked me flat. I wasn't watching anymore, but I opened my eyes and waited for another trigger squeeze. But the man didn't shoot again. He just looked back at me, climbed down from the truck, and they left.
Chosin has been described by some as America's worst military licking since the Battle of the Bulge during World War II, or maybe even Pearl Harbor. The numbers tell the story. The Marines and Army together suffered over 10,000 casualties, including frostbite and other physical impairments.
The Chinese had blown a bridge, and the Air Force was going to drop in a treadway bridge to be installed across the gap, which was 30 to 40 foot.
Treadway bridge sections weighed 2,900 pounds, and each was 16 feet long. They had never before been dropped by aircraft.
When we moved out of Coterie, it was at the beginning of the descent down into the Chinhongni Plateau, off the Coterie Plateau down to Chinhongni, which is in the valley. It was a very steep mountainous road, and part of the road was passing across a bridge built into a hydro power plant. Penstocks coming down off of the plateau, spinning the turbines and going on down. The bridge on the downhill side of the power plant had been blown by the Chinese. There was a huge hole in it, 30, 40 feet gape, and there was no way except if you walked, but you couldn't get any vehicles across it. And so somehow or other, the Marines were able to arrange with the Air Force to fly in the treadway bridges. And I'm not sure the numbers, but I think that they dropped 5. And I think 2 of them were destroyed, but 3 of them were usable. So the engineers were able to mount these bridges across this chasm, literally, in order to make a road available for us to continue to move out of there with our equipment and our wounded. And so that's the way we did it. If they hadn't have dropped those bridges, and I think it took 2 or 3 parachutes for each bridge, then we, again, would have been stopped cold. There was no way to get our equipment any further down the hill.
To the best of my knowledge, it was 8 aircraft. I think that I was in the first airplane that dropped, and we dropped from altitude about 800 feet. Personally, our plane didn't take any ground fire, but there was plenty of ground fire going on. You could see action on the ground, and it's hard to tell enemy from friendly forces, but we could see them on the ground.
I saw the bridges coming down, but at that time I didn't know what they were. I didn't know why we had stopped. And I see these parachutes, like I say, 2 or 3, with something hanging below them, but I don't know what it was. So then I found out later that it was the bridges.
The engineers in the process started putting the sections together and sliding them across the opening of the blown out bridge. And as they slid the sections across, they come to find out they was a few feet short of the abutment on the other side. To bridge that gap, they took dead Chinese bodies to fill in the gap up to the level of the bridge so that they could use it as an abutment for the troops to get across.
On December 9th and 10th, an endless stream of troops and vehicles poured across the span. There was no doubt this was the world's most important bridge at the time. For their contribution to the success of this operation, the 21st Troop Carrier Squadron, the 314th Troop Carrier Group, and the 801st Medical Air Evacuation Squadron received well-deserved Distinguished Unit citations, the first combat awards earned by Air Force units in the Korean War. Before the bridges were dropped, crucial support was provided by Combat Cargo Command, which had dedicated all of its C-46s, C-47s, and C-119s to support the resupply effort. Over 300 planes dropped 1,580 tons of supplies and equipment to the beleaguered troops.
Our pilot went and asked if he could follow VFR. He'd been there and flew the route enough. And he took off from Kimpo, crossed the river, picked up a railroad track that he knew. And he knew, and we flew practically on the railroad track all the way up there. And it was, he came around and asked the crew before he did it. He says, those guys need this stuff. And then we went in and dumped the stuff off and just climbed back up through the, he knew which way to get out of there.
We flew first for 6 days, and then the Marine, by this time we'd gotten their wounded out, almost down to the last of them. On the 5th day, they started fighting their way out to get out of the trap and started south. And the 6th day, we finished up and abandoned the base there at Haggeroo.
Pilots faced challenges flying in and out of an airbase, but the ride could be interesting for passengers as well.
The pilot said, get strapped in, because it's probably going to be a rough ride getting off because it was very windy. And he says, we might take some small arms fire from the Chinese. The thing that surprised me, on board the aircraft, there was a woman, a nurse, and I think an aid man. And the wounded were stacked on stretchers, one above the other. I was walking wounded, so I got to sit in a bucket seat.
The war was very, very difficult, extremely difficult, and my heart went out to the poor GIs, the ground pounders, the infantry and artillery that were over there trying to fight it, because they were being overwhelmed. As far as our flying was concerned, we had about 3 or 4 bases where we went primarily. Taegu was a major base, Pohang on the east coast, Pusan itself down at the where the coastline makes its bend, and in a couple of other smaller places. But we had no communications with the bases from our base in Japan. There were no weather reports that were worth anything. So what it amounted to was that when, for instance, if they wanted some people moved over to Korea, why, they'd load them on the airplane and we'd take them over there in the morning. We'd go out and take a look at the weather, and if we could get through, fine. If we couldn't, as in the extreme, sometimes we'd have to either go to a different base or even come back to Japan.
We flew up in an Air Force C-47 or R-4D, I'm not certain which it was. And we took some supplies up, gasoline and some other logistical items. And as we were approaching Haggeroo-Ri airstrip, I was able to get a look out the window and look down to see what the terrain looked like and what the countryside looked like. And I saw yellow flashes. And it didn't dawn on me at that time, but it did a little later that those yellow flashes were guns of some sort, rifles, small arms, what have you, which were firing at the aircraft. But we made it down all right, and we unloaded the gasoline and other supplies. And the moment I stepped out, just before unloading, I stepped out of the aircraft, I was struck by the intensity of the cold weather. I'd never been so cold in my life.
While Air Force planes continued to ferry troops in and out of Korea, the other half of the mission required dropping tons of supplies.
So the Air Force came over at that point with C-119s. We didn't know at that point what they were. We just knew that they were Air Force planes. They kind of looked like a pregnant P-38. And they began pushing bundles out the rear of the plane. And then the parachutes would pop open, and we began to get supplied by the Air Force because ground transportation wasn't available. The road was totally cut in several places by the Chinese. So we were dependent entirely upon the Air Force for our supplies for at least a week.
We were in the pattern awaiting our turn to land, and as I saw this Air Force plane, and I can't actually recall whether I saw it airborne and go in or the pilot called our attention to it, and we saw it down. But it was an Air Force transport that had crash landed maybe a mile or mile and a half off the end of the airstrip, and then we could see the guys get out and start to straggle back towards the perimeter. And of course that was Walter Kane's plane.
We landed at Hagaru-Ri, unloaded the supplies we had on the airplane, loaded up 36 wounded, and closed up the airplane and started the trip back to Yonpo. We took off. We got about 250 feet in the air, and there was no controls over the elevator, and the plane went off to the left wing, and we crashed about 1.5 miles behind the Chinese lines, 1.75 miles from the airstrip. I kicked the doors off the airplane. We got the wounded out of the airplane. The pilot and the co-pilot, they showed up from the front end. The pilot was bleeding like a stuck pig, small cut in his forehead, but he was blood to the waist. We got things arranged, and one of the sergeants and the Marines organized everything and said, this is the way we go. 3 of the wounded had to be carried, so we carried them back to the airstrip.
Naturally, there was some speculation as to what brought the plane down. Could it have been sniper fire? Paul Fritz shares a story.
I was making a landing once at Hagaru, and some couple of snipers down right below me on a kind of a knoll popped my airplane with a few rifle shells, and I could feel it. You know, the controls jiggled. And so when I got on the ground, I looked, and one of the holes was about a foot from the gas tank. So I went over to we had this radio jeep that controlled the traffic as well as they controlled the fighters. And I went over and told the guy on the radio jeep, I said, those son of a guns over there in that knob were just shooting at me. And these 2 fighters came down and dropped a napalm tank on them. And I tell you, you never heard such screaming in your life.
And I'm thankful for those planes that came in with the volunteers. And one of the most decorated airmen going was a flight nurse, Lillian Kell, that flew in flight after flight to stabilize guys at the runway and fly out with them. And they go back in and out under fire to those airstrips, bringing the guys out.
Sometimes we had to go to the nearest field. I mean, as was mentioned, Yonpo is a field that a lot of the patients went into. And of course then so many of those patients were lucky enough to get back into a MASH hospital. Others were just kept in a holding hospital. And then when we would pick them up, we would take them, as I mentioned before, to rear echelons. And these boys were frozen. They were shivering, and they didn't have enough coverage. Some of the wound areas were open because they cut the clothing at that particular area. And I know that at times we had jackets and blankets, and we would get the blankets and put over the boy because he was chattering. He was so cold, and his fingers were frozen. I mean, it was a terrible situation, and they were dirty, and they were bloody, and they were crying, and it was pretty sad. But then you work with those boys. You try to appease them. You try to make them feel that it's all right now. You're going home. You're going to get out of all of this, and that really made them very happy. And you had to act like you weren't scared.
I got to Osaka on the 7th of December. It was after dark, and after I landed there, I was in a sleeping bag, but of course they had thrown all my clothes away that I had on. It had a young lieutenant nurse. She'd been a nurse all of 2 weeks, and she just had graduated, and they called her in and shipped her to Japan right away. But she was mighty good. But she asked me, says, I understand you just left Hellfire Valley. Well, I didn't know what Hellfire Valley was. I thought she was just talking about North Korea, you know. And I told her, yeah. And she said, well, I'm gonna get you cleaned up a little bit. You're the filthiest bastard I've ever seen.
When you get young people, young boys on an aircraft, and they're in a great deal of pain, and some of them so happy to see an American woman, I mean, they forgot their pain. But the question is that you were so busy, you were trying so hard to get everything done and to get the patients situated. There really was not any emotion that you could feel. It was just like an emergency. It's a crisis, and you had to handle that crisis. So you couldn't think about yourself. I never did. I never felt that, you know, oh, I'm so sorry. There was nothing that I could do except to appease the individuals. And naturally, most of the patients, despite their wounds, were very happy. They're going home.
I flew 3 missions up to the Chosin Reservoir. The first being the 4th of December, the second on the 5th, and the last on the 6th of December. One of those trips, I don't remember which, I went into the other airstrip, Kotori, and took care again of the wounded Marines, and there were a few Army involved, and we evacuated them along with some frostbite victims, and we took out some of the dead.
Good Lord, I had a load of dead guys that had been loaded aboard. They were in the exact position of being just arms, legs, everything, everywhere, as they had fallen. And they had to intertwine the limbs and put a stack on each side of the fuselage and then tie them in so they wouldn't bounce around or anything. And I thought, well, this is just nothing like but a hearse. So I said, how do you fly with dignity with an airplane? So I tried to fly extra smoothly and so forth.
And one of the things that impressed me was the honor that was given the dead. They were brought to the airplane in a convoy with lights on, and each body was on a litter in a bag and brought onto the airplane. Everything was formal. One of the things I remember too is we'd have to fly back to Japan with our windows open because of the smell.
I handled patients, but mostly human remains. There were at times when we had to download from an aircraft from Korea about 30 bodies, and at times 80. The planes came into Yokota routinely, about once a week, and at times 2 or 3 times a week. I felt very sad for those deceased. When thinking about the family, I become very saddened.
One other thing is that I had a patient that had his face blown, and I still have the little note that he wrote me, "Will I live?" And it's getting a little worn now, and I better not take it out of its little cover because it's getting faint. But I really treasure that note because when he got on board, he asked me for a pen and paper, and I got it, and he said, "Will I live?" And I thought that was very sad. But he was thinking about his sister, and his sister would come to the hospital, and that he would be very happy to see her and be home.
Well over 100,000 U.S. troops were wounded during the Korean War. One of them had some extra company going home.
They told me after I got hit that there were guys waiting there for 10 days. I mean, the movie crew was waiting for 10 days to find somebody who had the right kind of wound. A head wound wouldn't work, or a wound that was minor that you just went to Japan and back. They wanted somebody who would go all the way to the States. And the reason for this, I think, was to let the loved ones back in the United States know what happens when their husband, boyfriend, or brothers, or whatever get hurt. What happens to them on the way home.
An American and the enemy come together on the battlefield. It was called mutual survival.
As I was walking, I was standing up at the time. 2 young boys threw their rifles out, 2 Chinese, I guess they're Chinese or Korean, threw their rifles out right in front of me. And they could have shot me, but they did. And they put their hands up and everything, and I motioned for him to come down to me. And I took one, and I motioned for him to go down at the bottom of the hill, and the other one I kept with me. And he was standing up with me, and I had him holler. I think at that time, if I can remember correctly, I think it was Toshan or something like that, to surrender or give up or something. And all of a sudden, I mean, they're shooting at him too. Now he's part of, because he gave up, so they're mad at him. So when I got hit in the leg, I did a pirouette, and the rifle went one way, and I landed down on the ground, and he lay down, and I took my hand and I put it in my wound in the back. I thought maybe an artery or some, or a vein might have been squirting. I could hold it, and but then I took my ammunition belt off and took my web belt off my trousers and put it around my leg, and I told him to tie a tourniquet, just twist it, I don't know if it's doing any good or not, I mean, you try anything when you think you're going to die. And we huddled down there. I mean, they were shooting at us, and we were just arm in arm around. I had my arm around his shoulder, and he had his arm around me, and we're buddy now. And then finally, one of the guys off to the side, one of my the guys in my squad, hollered, "Hey, George's been hit," So they sent a medic up, and two medics came up, put me on a stretcher, carried me down a hill, and into down, I guess we were battalion aid station. And we walked in, and all of a sudden I see all these bright lights, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And finally this guy comes over and he says, "My name is Owen Crump," and he says, "I'm a movie director from Warner Brothers, and we're here in conjunction with the DAV, and we'd like to make a movie of you, a documentary going home." And I said, at that time, I didn't ever care what you did. It hurt so bad I couldn't, And then Father Mike, he gave me the last rites. And then the next thing I remember is being put in a bubble on the outside of that helicopter. And up we went, and I remember just opening my eyes once, either when we were coming to land down in Seoul or on the way. And then everything gets hazy after that. When I got shot, and we were laying there with this, I don't know whether he's Chinese or, but he's young. He's only like 15, 16 years old, And he's probably in the same situation I am. He's there because somebody told him to go there. And if we met on the street somewhere, we could be probably drinking buddies or something. And it was, I think back sometimes and think, I can still feel his arms around me, around my shoulders, and I have my arm around him, and we're hugging the ground because the bullets are flying. They're mad at him for giving up. And so it was a camaraderie, instant camaraderie. You know what? I think if I knew who he was, and that if he was alive, whether he was a Chinese or Korean, and if I could just send him, you know what, I think in those days, if you sent him $5 a month, he'd be the king of the town, I've thought about him 1,000 times.
George Kritzman survived, but it took many months of recuperation and therapy. Nevertheless, he lived through the ordeal and was reunited with his family. During this time, many of the Air Force bases were located in Japan. It was only natural to employ Japanese support people during the Korean conflict.
During the Korean War, I worked at Tachikawa Air Base as a motor pool technician. Yes, I felt bad for the patients. The roads were bad, and the bus ride usually took 3 to 4 hours, and I could hear the wounded scream in pain.
The Japanese provided a variety of talents and expertise for the U.S. Air Force.
The only impression I had of Americans were from school and what I learned from the books. But in actuality, the GIs were very friendly and became friends. At first, I used to work on F-51s, then F-80s, F-82, F-84, and at the end of the war, I used to work on F-86s. There used to be 500 people working in 4 hangars. We were all Japanese nationals, some military, but we were divided into 4 hangars.
Support people were another group of professionals who supplied essential services and supplies for our fighting people in the air and on the ground.
Well, I've always felt that there's not enough recognition given to the support people. That, you know, I feel like what we were doing, we were supporting the air crews. That was our job. We had to do whatever we could to keep them happy, keep them well, and all that. In other words, you take any individual, any human being, who don't know when he's going to get paid. He don't know if he's going to be able to eat, if there's any food available, or a place to sleep. Now that individual is not going to perform very much. So somebody's got to be there to make sure that they get all this. And our job in the orderly room was to make sure that their pay was going through okay, and of course the quarters, they had place to stay, place they lived. They lived in the same similar type quarters we lived in, barracks, old barracks, and things of that type. So I felt like I was contributing a very important support to the men.
Our normal day would commence at about 7 o'clock in the morning and carry on for about 10 hours, and sometimes we'd be called in for other time, but we'd come in and process, maybe and load and move maybe 500 tons of cargo in a day, which doesn't seem very large now in today's comparison, but it's pretty significant in those days, in that tight, small facility that we had. And also our passenger load was running about 600 a day. These are passengers that we moved to Korea and they came in from Korea and to the United States. Primarily our biggest workload was the movement of passengers and medevacs to the United States.
Well, I was a personnel specialist in the orderly room, and my job was to take care of all the officers' personnel records and operate the mailroom at the same time. And of course, we had about 120 some officers in the squadron, I think it was. And I got to the point where I could type you a roster, a name, rank, serial number without looking at a record. I still know my former commander's serial number.
Every war takes a toll on the local civilian population, and the Korean War was no exception. Just prior to the Chinese capture of Seoul on January 4th, 1951, the Air Force, under the mission name Christmas Kid Lift, evacuated nearly 1,000 South Korean orphans.
We got there in December of '50, somewhere the first part of the month, but we had heard that the Chinese had gotten into the war, and we were in retreat at that point. And there was a couple of orphanages up in the Seoul area. And this Army chaplain was trying to arrange to get these children evacuated out of there and didn't want to abandon them to the Chinese. The Navy was supposed to come in with a transport and take them out. They had the kids out there all ready to be picked up and everything, but for some reason no boat showed up. And the chaplain got fairly desperate, and he talked to the high brass, I guess, and they finally tasked the Air Force, see if we could get them out. And of course, we were the ones there. So our squadron and the other 2 squadrons in our group, I forget the number of airplanes involved, but they were asked to go up to Seoul, to Kimpo, and get as many of these kids out of there as we could get out. They originally were told that they had 1 child per seat, the old troop seats on the C-54. And they felt that they weren't going to get these kids moved out of there fast enough that way, so they just folded up the troop seats and just brought the kids in, herded them into the airplane and told them to sit on the floor, and that was it.
I saw the little ones, and they were lined up, they were seated, they were sitting in a sitting position on either side of the airplane. And they were so darling. I mean, from almost, 1, 2, 3 years old, it was a beautiful sight to see them. But I was very jealous of the girls that were able to take that flight because it certainly was wonderful to see those little ones.
Compared to World War II, few novels and films emerged from the Korean War. The most well-known is The Bridges at Toko-ri. However, there was another film called Flight Nurse.
I was very surprised when Colonel Verena Zeller, she was the chief nurse of the Air Force Nurse Corps, called and asked me to be the technical advisor on a picture called Flight Nurse, and I thought, I couldn't believe that they were actually going to do a picture. And then I went to Republic Pictures, and there I met Joan Leslie, who played the flight nurse, and then they had a whole flight of flight nurses, and it was a terrific experience to be technical advisor and to be capable of seeing to it that all of the uniforms and the equipment and the incidences in the planes were as it was.
The Korean conflict continued with UN forces retaking Seoul on March 18, 1951. That same year, the first Navy jet strikes were launched. MacArthur was recalled, and truce talks began on July 10th. The next year, 1952, brought in Operation Fox Peter 1, the first time a fleet of jet fighters was supported by aerial refueling. 1952 also saw the first flight by large numbers of jet fighters from the United States to Japan.
Well, I think Fox Peter 1 meant probably Fighters Pacific 1, because they did tell us that it was the first time a wing had flown over ocean to Japan or whatever. So that's probably as good as any.
Fox Peter 1 was July of 1952, and I don't remember hearing too much about it beforehand up until the point we got our official briefing by Colonel Dave Schilling, who came in from SAC headquarters at Offutt and gathered all the tanker crews that were going to participate. There were 11 crews together in the base auditorium, and he didn't stand up on the stage or the podium. He came down right there among the troops, among the crews, and gave a very matter-of-fact, low-key but detailed briefing. Told us what we were going to do, which was to refuel, navigate for, and otherwise escort a wing of 60 F-84s, a straight wing F-84. It was, I think, the G model, from a base in Georgia to the West Coast, where we'd pick them up from Travis, go from Travis. Our route was Travis to Hickam Air Force Base, Honolulu, to Kwajalein Atoll, to Guam, to Anderson Air Force Base, and that was our termination point. Now the fighters went a slightly different, more circuitous route so they could land en route. They went from the West Coast to Hickam to Midway to Wake, to Kwaj, to Guam, to Iwo Jima, to Japan.
Somewhere prior to July 4th of 1952, orders came down assigning the 31st Fighter Escort Wing to an overseas destination. At that time, it was pretty highly classified, and the units were all dispersed. The fighter aircraft flew off to Travis Field in Fairfield, California, and then the various other units were assigned to different aircraft and ferried on to Travis Air Force Base also.
Well, on Fox Peter 1, our squadron flew to Hawaii and stayed there a night or two, and then we flew back east of Hawaii to meet the 31st Fighter Wing. And I think only half of them came that first day and half of them the second day. And the first time we met them, about 400 miles, I believe, east of Hawaii. And Colonel Thomas, our squadron CO, flew in my airplane that day as aircraft commander. He was sort of directing our squadron, of course. And when we got about 10 minutes out, he called the 31st Fighter Wing commander. I thought it was Dave Schilling, but whether it was or not. And he said, okay, we have you 10 minutes out. We're going to turn back to Hickam. And Schilling said, no, hold your course until we have you in sight. So about 5 minutes later, Colonel Thomas says, we're heading back for Hickam. We have you about 5 minutes out. And Schilling said, no, please hold your course. We want to have you in sight. So pretty soon, Colonel Thomas said again, well, we're going to turn back toward Hickam. And Schilling says, God damn it, Tommy. Said, hold your course till we have you in sight. And we held our course then until we had him in sight.
Everything seemed to go pretty well, except two of the aircraft had to return. Colonel Schilling was one of them because they couldn't hook up with the in-flight refueling. When we got to Misawa, I heard a lot of the pilots talk about the fact of their ride from Travis to the islands, the first islands, Hawaiian Islands, the strain on them sitting in the aircraft. But outside of that, they were all pretty confident that they were going to make it all the way across.
Well, you know, I remember more about the B-50s than I do about the actual F-84s. The boom operator would be in radio contact with the receiver aircraft, F-84, B-50, or whatever, and they would be giving very brief, terse, laconic instructions to the receiver pilot, saying like 2 feet up, 2 feet down, 3 feet left, 3 feet right, in maneuvering him into position where he could sock the boom to it. And they had, all the receiver aircraft had receptacles, and the boom was hydraulically operated, and the boom operator would hit whatever his control was and would shoot that boom right into the receptacle. Now you could feel that in the airplane too, just like you could feel a disconnect. There was a sharp jar that shook through the whole airplane when there was an automatic disconnect. But they'd give him verbal instructions over the radio. Now the rest of us on the airplane were in radio silence, and we couldn't use the intercom or anything electronic at all during the refueling operation.
One time we were refueling at Roswell when we first training, and we were sitting there. You'd go back and make hookups for a while, and then you'd come out and sit in on a pressurized compartment, and we'd sit there and smoke cigarettes, and the other boom operator would go back there and make hookups. And this one guy jerked his boom back, and the hose leaked, and it squirted out a stream of jet fuel and put out this one guy's cigarette. Well, we was all sitting there with our hair standing straight up, and we decided we wouldn't smoke after that while we were refueling.
In a second mass flight called Operation Fox-Peter 2, air refueling was extended over the Western Pacific. The Fox-Peter operations demonstrated the practicality of moving fighters to the Orient quickly by air, avoiding the corrosion potential of water transport. Near the end of the war, thousands of prisoners were exchanged. This was accomplished through two operations, Little Switch and Big Switch. Over 12,000 UN troops were exchanged by the North Koreans, while over 80,000 North Korean and Chinese prisoners were exchanged by United Nations forces. An additional 22,000 North Korean and Chinese chose not to return to North Korea or China after the war.
When the war was winding down, of course, General McCarty was involved with all airlift operations, and one of the things he was involved with was transporting prisoners of war from the Kojido Island for the other side, for the North Koreans, back up to north. That was one of the situations. We did fly into Kojido Island one time, and it was a dirt strip, but K-16 is where the prisoners came through in Operation Little Switch and Big Switch both. So we were there for both of them. Well, Operation Big Switch is where the regular POWs, the wounded POWs came home first on the Operation Little Switch. But when Big Switch came through, well, General McCarty found out that there was a C-46 crew, the only combat cargo crew that was shot down during the Korean War. They were dropping counterinsurgency people behind the front lines up in North Korea, and one of them turned out to be a North Korean and tossed a hand grenade in the airplane when he left and blew out the elevator control system, and they all bailed out. They all survived with the exception of the radio operator. They never did find out what happened to him. And General McCarty presented them with air medals when they on the ramp right there in front of the passenger terminal in Tachikawa.
As with any war, there's always a few amusing stories. Here's one regarding where a flight crew called home.
We stayed in the transit quarters the first few times we were there, which was an old Quonset hut, a small Quonset hut, with behind a passenger terminal with a little oil stove that never worked, and you got 2 dirty blankets on a folding cot. And after a couple of nights of that, we decided we'd spend the rest of our time in the Douglas Hilton, which was our C-54, and we had blue blankets, clean sheets.
The Korean War began on June 25th, 1950. It ended on July 27th, 1953, when the armistice was signed. The costs were high. Nearly 34,000 U.S. service people lost their lives, and over 100,000 were wounded.
In the last 4 days I was there, it turned out to be nothing but a gauntlet. All that was in my mind is, when will I get hit again and get killed?
While death claimed many, the weather affected everyone.
So all of us had frostbite, pretty bad. And so I think 20%, I don't know, this might have been 2,000 to 3,000 men were evacuated because of severe frostbite.
But when I got to Korea, then I really knew what cold was. I talked to a first sergeant one time, and this is after the war's over, and he said it was minus 40 degrees.
Had we not gotten there, conceivably, depending upon the severity of the wound, they would have died.
If you look back at it, it was probably the first brick to be kicked out of the wall of communism. From then on, I would say that it was the downfall of communism.
The pilots of this plane, whether they were Marines or Air Force, were magnificent people because of what they did there. And without that, we'd have been out of luck.